Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Vittrup Man. In 1915, peat cutters working a sodden bog called Vittrup Moes in the Vendsyssel region of northern Jutland sliced their spades into something that shouldn't have been there. A human skull, a jaw, an ankle bone, and lying inches away, a club of ashwood about 70 centimeters long. The remains went into a Danish museum cabinet and waited for 109 years. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed his death between 3300 and 3100 BCE, during the strange twilight zone when the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer world was being replaced, one valley at a time, by the first Neolithic farmers. He was between 30 and 40 years old. He stood 1.69 meters tall. He was robust, broad-shouldered, built like a man who lived by spear and snare. And whoever killed him struck him at least 8 times across the skull, hammering the left parietal and the occipital with deliberate, repeated force. The wooden club lying beside him in the peat matched the curvature of his cranial fractures. A weapon and a wound, fitted to each other across 53 centuries. For most of those 109 years, that was the entire story. Then, in February of 2024, a research team led by Anders Fischer, Carl Göran Sjögren, and Karin Margareta Frey published a paper in PLOS One that turned a forgotten cabinet specimen into one of the most important Mesolithic Neolithic forensic cases ever solved. They tested the strontium isotope ratios in his tooth enamel. The signature pointed nowhere near the calcareous bedrock of Denmark. It pointed to the granitic geology of southwestern Norway or central Sweden. They tested the oxygen isotopes. The values were too cold for the Danish lowlands and too cold for southern Scandinavia. He had grown up further north. They tested the carbon and nitrogen in his bone collagen. As a child, he had eaten a hunter-gatherer diet rich in marine protein. As an adult, he had switched to the cereal and livestock diet of a Neolithic farmer. They recovered his nuclear genome. He carried mitochondrial haplogroup I, 2A1b, and Y chromosome haplogroup I, 2A1A, 2A1A, both classic Scandinavian hunter-gatherer signatures. And critically, his genome showed essentially zero ancestry from the Anatolian Neolithic farmers who had been spreading north from the Mediterranean. He was a pure hunter-gatherer who had moved south as a young man, settled into a farming community in northern Denmark, eaten their food for years, and was then killed and placed in a bog. The pollen embedded in the sediment on his skull placed his death in autumn or early winter. He is now the earliest forensically documented case of a long-distance migrant ritually killed in prehistoric Europe. A foreigner absorbed, then sacrificed. The implication is dark. 5,300 years before the European Union existed, a man crossed half of Scandinavia, was integrated into a community, and was murdered by it as an offering. The bog had kept his body. Modern forensics finally returned his name to history, even if his given name is gone forever. Number 2. Gebelein Man, also known as Ginger. He had been on public display in the British Museum since 1901. Over 100 years of school groups, of tourists snapping photos, of curators rotating exhibits around him, and nobody knew he was a murder victim. He was discovered in 1896 by Wallace Budge at the site of Gebelein in Upper Egypt, about 40 kilometers south of Luxor. He was one of 6 naturally mummified bodies pulled from a sandpit cemetery there. The Egyptian climate had done the embalming. There were no resins, no linen wrappings, no priestly preparation. He had simply been buried in hot, dry sand, and the sand had drawn every drop of moisture out of his body within weeks. His skin preserved, his fingernails preserved, his hair preserved in the tight reddish curls that earned him the nickname Ginger. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 3500 and 3400 BCE, during the late Naqada II cultural phase, 4 to 5 centuries before the unification of Egypt under Narmer. The pyramids were still over 1,000 years in his future. He was between 18 and 21 years old. He stood 1.63 meters tall. He was robust. For 116 years, the museum's interpretation of his death was, essentially, none. He was just an exceptionally well-preserved pre-dynastic Egyptian. Then, in 2012, the British Museum's Daniel Antoine and John H. Taylor wheeled him into the Cromwell Hospital in London and slid him into a Siemens somatum definition flash CT scanner. 1,400 cross-sectional slices later, they had their answer. Hidden under his shoulder blade, invisible to the naked eye, was a stab wound about 2.5 centimeters wide and 5 centimeters deep. The blade had passed between his fourth and fifth ribs, severed the soft tissue between them, and pierced his lung. The angle of the wound suggested an attacker of roughly his own height, striking from behind, with a copper or flint knife about 12 centimeters long. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or forearms. He hadn't seen it coming. The CT scan also revealed his last meal, preserved as a small, dense mass in his stomach. Grain, fish bones, sediment. He had eaten within 2 to 4 hours of his death. His grave goods, found with him in 1896, were red-polished and black-topped Nakata II pottery, the kind given to a person of at least middle status, not a slave, not a condemned criminal. 6 years later, in 2018, the museum used infrared imaging on his skin and discovered something else nobody had noticed in over a century of display. He was tattooed. Across his upper right arm, in soot and fat-based ink, he carried the figurative outlines of a wild bull and a Barbary sheep. The earliest figurative tattoos in the human archaeological record by roughly 1,000 years. A pre-dynastic Egyptian man, eaten by sun and sand, walking into a museum in the year 1900, carrying the world's oldest documented murder wound, the world's oldest documented figurative tattoos, and a stomach full of grain. CT scanning at 13 images per centimeter revealed all of it. Forensics gave him his story back, the violent ending nobody had bothered to look for. Number 3. The Beachy Head Lady. In the early 1950s, landscaping work near the white chalk cliffs of Beachy Head on the south coast of England turned up a human skeleton. It went into a box in the Eastbourne Heritage Center, was catalogued with minimal notes, and sat there for the next 6 decades. 60 years of obscurity. In 2013, an Eastbourne osteoarchaeologist named Joe Seaman was working through the Eastbourne Ancestors Project, a public initiative to study 300 previously unexamined skeletons in the museum's collections. He pulled her box, he looked at her skull, and he began the forensic process that would, in the next 12 months, overturn 15 centuries of assumptions about who lived in Roman Britain. Radiocarbon dating placed her death between 200 and 250 CE, in the middle of the Severan dynasty of Roman emperors. She was between 23 and 30 years old. She stood 1.63 meters tall. She had no skeletal pathology and no signs of violent injury. She had simply died and been buried in a simple east-west supine inhumation along the Roman British coast. Joyce Feiler's craniometric analysis of her skull, comparing its measurements against ancient and modern reference populations, indicated ancestral affinities most consistent with sub-Saharan African groups rather than European, Mediterranean, or North African ones. The team commissioned a facial reconstruction performed by Caroline Wilkinson at Liverpool John Moores University, using the Manchester method of layered tissue depth markers built over a 3D printed replica of her cranium. The image released to the public in February of 2014 showed a young woman with dark skin, tight curled black hair, and broad facial features. Then, the isotope work began. Janet Montgomery and Jane Evans at the British Geological Survey ran her tooth enamel through high-precision mass spectrometry. Her strontium-87 to strontium-86 ratio came out at 0.7095. That number ruled out the chalk bedrock of southern England as her place of childhood entirely. Her oxygen-18 value was about -4 per mil, indicating childhood drinking water from equatorial or tropical latitudes. Her carbon and nitrogen isotopes told the dietary story. As a child, she had eaten a diet rich in C4 plants, millet, and sorghum, the staple crops of West African and Sahelian agriculture. As an adult, she had switched to the C3 diet of European wheat and barley. The shift placed her geographic move somewhere in her mid-adolescence. The combined isotope signature pointed to what is now Nigeria, Cameroon, or the broader Sahel. There were no shackle abrasions on her ankles or wrists. There were no occupational stress markers consistent with hard labor. Her teeth showed evidence of careful daily hygiene, atypical of slave populations. The team's hypothesis was that she had migrated voluntarily, possibly as a merchant, a courtesan, or a member of an elite household, via the Roman trans-Saharan trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North African ports and onward across the Mediterranean to Britain. She is now one of at least 28 documented sub-Saharan African individuals identified in Roman-British contexts since 2013. Roman Britain was never the monoculture popular history once imagined. Strontium ratios, oxygen ratios, and a single skull cataloged in a council museum proved it. Number 4. The Pazyryk Ice Maiden. In 1993, the Russian archaeologist Natalia Polosmak was excavating a burial mound called Ak-Alaka III on the Ukok Plateau, high in the Altai Republic of southern Siberia, at about 2,500 meters above sea level. The kurgan, the burial mound, belonged to the Pazyryk culture, an Iron Age Scythian-related group of mounted nomads who had ranged across the Altai Mountains between roughly 600 and 300 BCE. When her team broke through the wooden chamber, they realized the inside had filled with water shortly after burial and then frozen permanently inside the Siberian permafrost. They had not just opened a tomb. They had opened a deep freezer that had been running uninterrupted for about 2,400 years. Inside the wooden coffin, carved from a single trunk of larch, was a slender young woman. She was between 25 and 28 years old. She stood 1.67 meters tall. She had not given birth. Around her, 6 horses lay sacrificed in full saddlery. Beside her was a yak hair and silk headdress, nearly a meter tall, a bag of coriander seeds, a polished mirror, and a small copper censer. And on her left shoulder, on her wrists, and on her thumb were tattoos. Stylized animal motifs rendered in dark blue, black, soot and fat-based ink. The most striking was a coiled stag or tree of life figure with eagle-headed antlers spiraling down her shoulder onto her upper arm. She was, instantly, the most photographed prehistoric body in Central Asian archaeology. But the most important thing about her was not visible to the naked eye. The initial autopsy in 1993 by Polosmak and pathologist Eduard Milnikov noted an unusual asymmetry in her right breast region. They lacked the imaging technology to investigate further. They closed her up and waited. 17 years later, in 2010, a follow-up examination was conducted at the International Tomography Center of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk, led by Andrei Letyagin. They used multi-slice CT and MRI together. The MRI showed a large mass in her right breast, about 4 centimeters across. The mass had infiltrated her right axillary lymph nodes. Lytic lesions had spread into her right humerus and into 4 of her right ribs. The pattern was diagnostic of advanced ductal carcinoma of the breast with extensive bone metastasis. She is now the oldest known case of breast cancer in a forensically examined human body. The team also analyzed the residue inside her copper sensor. High concentrations of cannabis. The interpretation is hard to avoid. She had been using cannabis fumes, almost certainly, as analgesia for chronic cancer pain during the final months or years of her life. She is now also the earliest documented case of palliative cannabis use. She had bone bruising on her right hip and a fracture in her shoulder, consistent with a fall from horseback within her final year. likely a consequence of cancer-related frailty. Cancer was once described in textbooks as a disease of modernity. A 2,400-year-old tattooed Scythian woman frozen inside an ice lens at 2,500 meters elevation proved that wrong with a single MRI scan. Number 5. Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man, Ireland's bog-body princes. In February of 2003, a peat harvesting machine in Clonycavan, County Meath, struck a human body buried in the bog. 4 months later, in June of 2003, a different peat cutting machine in Croghan Hill Bog, County Offaly, did the same. 2 Iron Age bodies, surfacing in the same year, about 40 kilometers apart. The investigation that followed, led by Eamon P. Kelly at the National Museum of Ireland in collaboration with the British Museum and the University of Cambridge, treated them as paired cases. They had been killed within the same century. They had been killed in the same way. They had been killed for the same reason. Old Croghan Man's torso, arms, and hands were recovered. His legs had been severed by the machine. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 362 and 175 BCE. Calculations based on his arm span gave him a living height of about 1.98 meters, 6 feet 6 inches, exceptionally tall for the Iron Age. His fingernails were manicured. His hands were soft. His fingertips bore no occupational wear. He had never performed manual labor in his life. He was, almost certainly, an aristocrat, possibly a candidate for kingship. He had been stabbed in the chest. His nipples had been sliced clean off. His arms had been pierced with hazel rods and tied. He had been decapitated. His torso had been severed at the waist. The pattern is called the threefold death in early Irish ritual. The removal of the nipples carries a specific symbolic weight. In early Irish kingship ceremony, a vassal demonstrated submission to a king by suckling the king's nipples. Removing them was deliberate symbolic disqualification. Even in death, he could never be king. Stable isotope analysis of his nails and hair showed a high-meat, high-protein diet in his final months, which is atypical of the largely plant-based Iron Age peasant diet and entirely consistent with elite status. Clonycavan Man was younger, between 19 and 25 at death. He stood only 1.57 meters tall. He had a striking tall topknot of dark hair, held in place by hair gel made from pine resin and vegetable oil. The pine resin was chemically sourced to southwestern France or northern Spain, the earliest evidence of long-distance Iron Age trade between Ireland and continental Europe. His skull had been crushed by a heavy axe blow to the back of the head. His nose had been chopped, his chest opened, his abdomen disemboweled, and his nipples had been sliced off, just like old Croghan Man. Isotope analysis of his hair and nails showed the same elite high-protein diet. Both bodies had been deposited near major tribal boundaries. Old Croghan Man near the border between the Uí and Brega kingdoms. Clonycavan Man near the border between Brega and Meaty. Kelly's interpretation, published in his 2006 monograph Kingship and Sacrifice, is that both men were failed king candidates, ritually executed at the edges of their tribal territories to placate the sovereignty goddess after a perceived failure of kingship. A famine, a plague, a military defeat. 2 centuries of ritual political theater, performed identically across what is now Central Ireland, recovered from a peat bog by accident, and read with 20 first-century forensic tools. Their faces are still on display at the National Museum of Ireland on Kildare Street in Dublin, where old Croghan Man's hand, with its manicured nails, is one of the most viewed objects in the museum. Number 6. Ramses the Third. He was the second pharaoh of the 20th dynasty of Egypt. He reigned from approximately 1186 to 1155 BCE. He is regarded as the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom before its long decline. and for 3,100 years, his death was an open question. The Judicial Papyrus of Turin, the Lee Papyrus, and the Rollin Papyrus, three separate ancient documents collectively known as the Harem Conspiracy Papyri, all described a plot to assassinate him. The plot was orchestrated by Queen Tae, one of his secondary wives, and her son Prince Pentower. Their goal was to install Pentower on the throne in place of the designated heir, Ramses IV. The papyri name about 40 conspirators, officials, butlers, harem inspectors, military officers. The trial documents describe wax magical figurines, harem manipulation, and a violent strike against the pharaoh. But the documents are ambiguous on one critical question. Did the assassins actually succeed? Was Ramses III killed by his own family, or were they caught before they could finish the job? His mummy, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari royal cache in 1881, showed no visible external wound. For over 13 decades after his rediscovery, the question remained unanswered. In February of 2012, an international research team led by Albert Zink at the Institute for Mummies and the Iceman in Bolzano, Frank Rulli at the University of Zurich, and Zahi Hawass for the Egyptian Antiquities Service published their analysis in the Christmas issue of the British Medical Journal. They had run his mummy through a Toshiba Aquilion 64-slice CT scanner, 14,000 individual cross-sectional slices. The scan revealed a deep transverse cut across his throat, approximately 7 centimeters wide, severing the trachea, the esophagus, and the major blood vessels down to the cervical vertebrae. The wound had been hidden beneath thick embalming bandages and a wide Horus Eye amulet placed directly over the throat, almost certainly by the embalmers as a magical gesture intended to heal the king for the afterlife. The cleanliness of the cut, made with what appears to have been a single decisive motion using a sharp, single-edged blade between 5 and 8 centimeters wide, indicates a focused execution rather than a struggle. The scan also revealed that his left big toe had been completely severed shortly before death, probably with an axe, possibly a second attacker delivering a coup de grace. And in the same study, the team analyzed DNA from a separate mummy from the Deir el-Bahari cache. An unidentified body labeled Unknown Man E, wrapped in goatskin, with no embalming incisions, his face frozen in an open-mouthed expression of distress. Y chromosome and autosomal markers matched Ramses III. He was a close male relative. His neck showed signs consistent with strangulation by a rope or fabric noose. He is now almost certainly identified as Prince Pentor, the conspirator's son, executed by forced suicide in the disgraceful manner the trial documents describe. The harem conspiracy succeeded. Ramses III was assassinated. His killers were caught, executed, and improperly buried. The CT scanner confirmed all of it, 3,100 years after the courtroom verdict. The earliest forensically confirmed political assassination of a head of state in human history. Number 7. The Hatshepsut Mummy. Hatshepsut was the 5th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. She reigned from approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE. She was one of the most successful, longest-reigning female pharaohs in Egyptian history. After her death, her successor Thutmose III, who had ruled in her shadow for 2 decades, began a campaign of damnatio memoriae against her about 20 years after her funeral. He defaced her monuments. He scraped her name from inscriptions. He removed her mummy from her prepared royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. For 3,500 years, she was missing. In 1903, Howard Carter discovered tomb KV-60 in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb contained 2 unidentified female mummies, one in a coffin, later identified as her royal nurse, Cedar Inn, one lying directly on the bare floor beside an open coffin, designated KV-60A. Carter, deeming this floor mummy unimportant, did not remove her. She remained in the tomb on the bare floor for 103 years. Tourists occasionally photographed her. Nobody connected her to the missing queen. In 2006, Zahi Hawass, formally launched the Egyptian Mummy Project, with a specific goal of identifying Hatshepsut. They narrowed the candidates to 4 mummies, KV-60A, and 3 female mummies held at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The breakthrough came from a small wooden canopic chest. The chest, recovered from the Deir el-Bahari royal cache decades earlier, was inscribed with Hatshepsut's cartouche. It had long been catalogued as containing her embalmed liver and a single molar tooth. In June of 2007, Ashraf Selim's CT scanning team at the Egyptian Museum scanned the canopic chest using a Siemens Somatom emotion scanner. The scan revealed a single isolated molar, about 1.6 centimeters long, with a distinctive missing root configuration. Selim's team then CT scanned all 4 candidate mummies' jaws. The molar matched, to within fractions of a millimeter, the gap in the upper right jaw of mummy KV-60A in the position of the second molar. The root socket dimensions and the broken root profile aligned exactly. Forensic odontologist Yehia Zakaria Gad calculated the probability of a false match at less than 1 in a million. KV-60A was Hatshepsut. She had been lying on the floor of her own neighboring tomb, ignored, photographed by schoolchildren for over a century. Further forensic analysis revealed she had been about 50 years old at death. She was obese, with abdominal fat folds preserved in her mummification. She had advanced osteoporosis, severe dental abscesses, and metastatic bone cancer in her pelvis. Her cause of death was almost certainly septicemia from an infected tooth, combined with the underlying weakness of cancer. She was reunited with her canopic chest, with the tooth that had identified her, and placed at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo. 1 molar restored a female pharaoh to history. Number 8. King Tutankhamun. He is the most famous mummy in the world. He was the 11th or 12th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, reigning from approximately 1332 to 1323 BCE. He ascended the throne at the age of 9. He died at approximately 19. Howard Carter discovered his intact tomb, KV-62, in November of 1922, the only royal tomb of the New Kingdom found with its primary burial contents largely undisturbed. For 88 years afterwards, the cause of his early death was one of the most argued questions in archaeology. Chariot accident, hippopotamus attack, sickle cell anemia, temporal lobe epilepsy, congenital heart disease, snakebite, political murder by his vizier A. An X-ray of his skull, taken in 1968 by R.G. Harrison at the University of Liverpool, showed an unexplained density at the base of the skull. The writer Bob Breyer seized on it in his 1998 book, The Murder of Tutankhamun, arguing the boy king had been struck from behind by an assassin. In 2005, the Egyptian Mummy Project under Zahi Hawass conducted an initial CT scan that demolished the murder theory. No perimortem skull fracture. The base of skull density was embalming material, not bone trauma. But the cause of death was still unknown. The definitive answer came in 2010 in a Journal of the American Medical Association paper led by Hawass and Karsten Pusch at the Eberhard Karls University of Tübingen. They combined CT scanning, ancient DNA, and stable isotope analysis across Tut and 10 other 18th dynasty royal mummies. The largest royal mummy genetic study ever conducted. DNA confirmed his parentage. His father was Akhenaten. His mother was the KV-35 younger lady, who was identified as Akhenaten's full sister, herself a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. Tutankhamun was the product of full sibling incest. The genetic burden of that inbreeding explained the entire cluster of congenital disorders his body carried. A cleft palate, a clubfoot, talipes equinovarus on his left side, Köhler disease, a vascular necrosis of the foot bones, scoliosis of the spine. The CT scan also identified a complete fracture of the left femur immediately above the knee, with embalming resin pooled within the fracture cavity, confirming the injury occurred just before death. The fracture pattern was incompatible with chariot impact. It was consistent with a simple fall, likely from a standing position, made dangerous by his club foot. And in his DNA, the team detected Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the deadliest form of malaria, the earliest genetic detection of malaria in any ancient body. The diagnosed cause of death was the combination of an open femoral fracture with bacterial sepsis in a young man already debilitated by congenital disorders, while simultaneously suffering an active falciparum malaria infection. He was about 1.67 meters tall. He walked with a pronounced limp. 130 walking canes were found in his tomb, consistent with the clinical picture. A 2014 virtual autopsy by the BBC and Albert Zink's team produced the first scientifically rigorous facial reconstruction, depicting a slim youth with overbite feminine features and an obvious clubfoot. A 2024 follow-up with improved aDNA techniques reconfirmed the family tree at higher coverage. The most famous body in archaeology is now also the most rigorously forensically investigated body in history. 88 years of theories. 1 JAMA paper. Cold case closed. The 8 cases you have just walked through were solved by a relatively small toolkit, but every single tool in that kit is a recent invention. Multi-detector computed tomography is the workhorse. A modern 64 or 128 slice hospital CT scanner produces between 1,400 and 14,000 individual cross-sectional images of an ancient body, with resolution down to 0.5 millimeter. The Siemens Somatom definition. Flash, the Toshiba Aquilion, the Siemens Somatom emotion. These are the same machines used in hospital emergency rooms, repurposed for the dead. Magnetic resonance imaging adds soft tissue resolution on the rare bodies, like the Pazyryk Ice Maiden that still holds soft tissue. The Institute for Mummies and the Iceman in Bolzano, founded around the discovery of Otzi in 1991, has become one of the world's leading research hubs for combined imaging. Ancient DNA recovery operates on bench protocols developed in the laboratories of Svante Pääbo, who won the 2022 Nobel Prize for his Neanderthal work. The standard approach is shotgun sequencing of fragmented DNA, followed by target enrichment via hybridization capture. Coverage thresholds matter. A genome at 0.1 times coverage allows broad ancestry estimates. A genome at 1 times coverage allows reliable haplogroup assignment and limited disease allele detection. A genome at 30 times coverage allows full clinical grade analysis. The petrous bone of the inner ear and the cementum of the teeth are the most reliable aDNA reservoirs in degraded remains. The cleanroom standards that surround every step of the work are pharmaceutical grade. Isotope analysis runs on multi-collector inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometers, the MC-ICP-MS machines, which produce strontium isotope ratios to 5 decimal places of precision. The British Geological Survey and the NERC Isotope Facility have built reference databases of European geological signatures over the past 3 decades. Mass spectrometry detects trace drug residues, palliative cannabis, embalming compounds, dental sealants. Pollen analysis dates seasons. Toolmark analysis matches weapons. Histology identifies tumors. Proteomics identifies peptides that survive when DNA has degraded entirely. The multi-omics approach to ancient bodies, the integration of all of these methods simultaneously, is barely 15 years old. Every single case we have walked through was solved by that toolkit, and the toolkit is still being built. Among these tools, isotope analysis is the most powerful for one specific question. Where did this person grow up? The principle is simple. Strontium isotope ratios, the proportion of strontium-87 to strontium-86, vary by the age and type of the underlying bedrock. Granitic mountain regions produce high ratios. Chalk lowlands produce low ratios. The strontium gets into local plants through groundwater, into local animals through plants, and into local humans through diet. By the time a child's permanent teeth have finished forming, around the age of 12, Their dental enamel has locked in a permanent record of the strontium ratio of their childhood region. Tooth enamel is sealed. It does not remodel. It carries the geographic fingerprint of childhood for the rest of life and well past death. Oxygen isotopes do the same job for climate. The ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in drinking water depends on temperature, latitude, and altitude. A child raised in tropical equatorial Africa records a very different oxygen signature than a child raised in northern Scandinavia. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes diagnose diet. Carbon-13 distinguishes C3 plants like wheat and barley from C4 plants like millet, sorghum, and maize. Nitrogen-15 records trophic level. A meat-rich diet sits higher in the nitrogen isotope scale than a plant-based diet. Vittrup Man's strontium pointed to Norway. Beachy Head Lady's strontium pointed to West Africa. The Pazyryk Ice Maiden's isotopes confirmed her Indo-European Scythian origin. Old Croghan Man's nitrogen confirmed his elite diet. Each ratio is a sentence in a biographical story written in tooth enamel. Ancient DNA does the parallel work for relationships and disease. Since Svante Pääbo published the Neanderthal genome in 2010, the cost of sequencing an ancient genome has dropped from over $100,000 to under $1,000. The David Reich Lab at Harvard, the Pontus Skoglund Lab at the Crick Institute, and the Eske Willerslev Lab at Copenhagen have between them sequenced tens of thousands of ancient individuals. Disease allele detection has identified malaria in Tutankhamun, plague in medieval Black Death victims, leprosy in medieval European cemeteries, and tuberculosis in ancient South Americans before European contact. Phenotype prediction has revealed eye color, pigmentation, and lactase persistence in dozens of prehistoric individuals. But aDNA has hard limits. Bog acidity hydrolyses DNA. The Beachy Head Lady's chalk substrate degraded her DNA to fragments. Gebelein Man's 120 years of museum display destroyed most of his recoverable sequences. Tropical heat ruins everything. Bodies older than roughly 100,000 years routinely yield no DNA at all. Proteomics, the analysis of peptides that survive when DNA collapses, is now filling that gap. The frontier is rapidly moving towards single-molecule sequencing of ultra-degraded DNA, with platforms from Oxford Nanopore and Pacific Biosciences reading individual molecules rather than amplified fragments. The ethical considerations are growing in parallel. The Indigenous Data Sovereignty Movement, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and similar frameworks across Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are reshaping who gets to read ancestral genomes and under what conditions. For Egyptian forensics specifically, one machine has done more than any other to transform the field. The CT scanner. The first hospital CT scan of an Egyptian mummy was conducted in 1976 on Pum II at the University of California. For 3 decades, it remained a rare specialist tool. Zahi Hawass's Egyptian Mummy Project, formally launched in 2005, made it routine. The 2007 Hatshepsut identification through canopic chest dental matching. The 2010 JAMA study on Tutankhamun. The 2012 Ramses the Third throat cut revelation. The 2012 Gebelein Man stab wound. 4 landmark cases in 5 years, all driven by the same imaging modality. The methodology is minimally invasive. Multi-detector scanning at half-millimeter slice intervals. Software reconstruction in 3 dimensions, allowing virtual unwrapping. Density differentiation between embalming resin, linen wrappings, and human tissue. The Egyptian Museum opened a dedicated CT facility in 2006. The British Museum partnerships with the Cromwell Hospital in London handle sensitive mummies that cannot leave museum environments without escort. The Tübingen Institute for Mummies coordinates the global research network. The same methodology now scans Inca, Andean, European, and Asian mummies. The new field of virtopsy, virtual autopsy without physical intervention, is changing how forensic medicine operates, not just on ancient remains, but on modern coroner's cases as well. Synchrotron-based phase contrast CT is now achieving sub-micron resolution. Within the next decade, every major mummy collection on Earth will likely have been imaged at this resolution. The next wave of cold case reveals is queued up. 8 cases, 8 reveals, and patterns begin to emerge. Several of these victims were elite. Old Croghan Man with his manicured nails. Clonycavan Man with his imported pine resin hair gel. Ramses the Third on his throne. Hatshepsut on hers. Tutankhamun in his solid gold inner coffin. Several were long-distance migrants. Vittrup Man from Norway. The Beachy head lady from West Africa. The Pazyryk Ice Maiden's Indo-European Scythian community pushed eastward from the Pontic steppe. Several died by ritual or political violence. The Vittrup wetland sacrifice. The Irish kingship execution. The Ramses harem conspiracy. Pentower's forced suicide. Several carried disease as their final burden. Tut's malaria. Hatshepsut's bone cancer. The Pazyryk woman's breast cancer. The 8 cases span 3,300 years. They span 5 geographical regions: Egypt, Britain, Ireland, Denmark, and Siberia. The preservation environments themselves are a catalog of forensic luck. Sand, peat, ice, royal embalming, naturally desiccating dry climate, and then museum storage rooms where bodies have waited, sometimes for over a century, for the right technology to arrive. The time lag between body discovery and definitive forensic resolution averages, across these 8 cases, between 50 and 120 years. The named research teams, Hawass and Zink, Pabo and Skoglund, Fry and Polosmak, and Kelly and Antoine, are doing in the 2020s what their predecessors could not do in the 1920s. The case is the same, only the toolkit has changed. For every case forensics has cracked, there are cases it has not. The Tolland Man, hanged in an Iron Age Danish bog around 350 BCE, is among the best preserved bog bodies on Earth. We know his last meal in detail. We know exactly how he was hanged. We do not yet know why. Was he a criminal? A sacrifice? A volunteer? The Lindo Man from Cheshire in northwestern England carries multiple injuries: strangulation, throat cutting, blunt force trauma. But the ritual or criminal context of his death is still debated decades after his 1984 discovery. The Tarim Basin mummies of Western China, dated to between 2000 and 3000 BCE, are now genetically characterized as a deeply isolated indigenous population, but the language they spoke and the cultural network they inhabited remain disputed. The princes in the tower, the 2 royal English children believed murdered in 1483, cannot be DNA tested because the Church of England will not authorize the exhumation of the urn at Westminster Abbey. The Lake Mungo man and lady, the oldest known modern humans in Australia at around 42,000 years, are at the center of an ongoing indigenous repatriation dispute and have not been comprehensively studied since their early 1970s excavation. Ötzi the Iceman has been examined in extraordinary detail, and we know his arrow wound, his last meal, his gut microbiome. But the motive for his murder, the politics of his Copper Age alpine community, remains speculative. The Lulai Laco, Capacocha children, sacrificed at altitude by the Inca around 1500 CE, are biologically known but socially obscure. Australian, sub-Saharan African, and tropical bodies remain disproportionately understudied because aDNA recovery in those environments is the hardest. The diagenetic alteration of isotope ratios in tropical soils complicates strontium and oxygen work in those regions too. Political and ethical constraints are tightening. Indigenous repatriation, sacred site protection, and descendant community consent are reshaping what gets studied and when. The future of unsolved case work will likely depend on proteomics, lipidomics, and microbiome analysis for the bodies that have outrun ADNA's reach. What forensic archaeology will look like in 2035 is already taking shape. Portable XRF guns are now used in the field for elemental analysis without removing samples from their original context. Single molecule sequencing is reading ancient DNA fragments, smaller than 50 base pairs, well below the previous detection limit. Oxford Nanopore and Pacific Biosciences' long-read platforms are reconstructing ancient genomes from individual molecules. Synchrotron-based phase contrast CT is producing sub-micron internal images of mummies, allowing the imaging of individual neurons in preserved brain tissue. The David Reich Lab has stated a public target of 1 million ancient genomes by 2030. Machine learning models are being trained on the British Geological Survey isotope database to automate provenance assignment from a single tooth enamel chip. The indigenous data sovereignty movement is rewriting the rules of consent, ownership, and access. Repatriation frameworks modeled on NAGPRA are spreading from the United States to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Brazil. The destructive sampling era of aDNA is ending. Minimally invasive bone core extraction, single-strand library protocols, and proteomic peptide analysis are reducing the physical cost of every investigation. Microbiome work on gut and oral microbiota is revealing diet, disease, and intestinal pathology in ways no skeletal analysis could. Pathogen aDNA work continues to recover plague, leprosy, tuberculosis, and now coronaviruses from historical remains. Epigenetic ancient genomics is reading methylation patterns to estimate the age at death of individuals to within a few years. Forensic facial reconstruction is achieving photograph realistic detail. Citizen science platforms are crowdsourcing the reanalysis of archived museum specimens that have sat in drawers for over a century. The British Museum alone holds approximately 7,000 mummies, the vast majority of which have never been CT scanned. Within the next decade, dozens of new cold case reveals are statistically certain. Every museum drawer, every storage box in a council heritage center, every unmarked coffin in an attic at a university department may hold another case waiting for the right technology to arrive. The 8 bodies in this video sat unread for an average of nearly a century before forensics caught up with them. The bodies still waiting are out there. The toolkit will reach them eventually.